Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And happy Father's Day, first of all, to all the fathers out there. Scotty, happy Father's Day.
Yeah, happy Father's Day.
Yeah, and what we're going to do today, I saw this. I want to, if you watch the news, they get so caught up in like this little story and that little story that I almost think, in a way, what seems to me to be a much bigger picture and a much more important picture. Yeah, it does get mentioned, it does get addressed, but really that's the story. The rest is just little details, really. What I wanted to do today is just take a step back. This thing admittedly was inspired by a little movie that I saw. I don't usually watch whole movies like that. I mean, when I first started, I said, well, I'll look at the first few minutes. I watched the whole thing. It was an hour and 40 minutes. But it's not about trying to convince you of one side or the other. Some people are going to prefer one perspective. Other people are going to prefer another perspective. I certainly have my perspective. And admittedly, no doubt, I'm sure it's going to come out over the next half hour or whatever long this podcast is. But that's not my intention or goal. My intention or goal is just give the facts, and then you can make up your own mind. Okay. So to start with, there was this guy, and this is sort of the first thing I saw this week that kind of inspired me to pursue all the material in this podcast, really. There was this guy, his name was Dostoevsky. He was around when was that? Late 1800s, I think, mid 1800s in Russia. And he wrote several books, and there's this quote of his that I thought was rather compelling. He said, in Russia today, there is crime without punishment, and there is punishment without crime. And what really caught my attention with that isn't about what was going on in Russia all that long ago, but what's going on in the United States right now. And again, how do I say this without sounding like I have a political side? I guess I do. But I mean, if you just look at the facts, and I don't want to get off on politics too much here, but just briefly, Hillary Clinton had a server in her home with classified documents on it. She wasn't the president. She had no right to do that. And just got away with it. Isn't that? Oh, and then she took her hammer or whatever and smashed up her cell phone and her SIM cards and all that, even though they were subpoenaed, huh? That's just wrong. That's crime without punishment. At any rate, and then when you look at Donald Trump, and he's indicted for 37 counts. If he's found guilty of all of them, he'd go to jail for 400 years. And if you read the laws, and I don't know if you're paying attention to this, but if you read the laws, even judgments made in very similar cases by liberal judges, he had every right to have those documents and to declassify them. And there's no formal proceedings whereby a president declassifies his documents. He just takes them, says they're declassified. That's it. Anyway, enough on that. I'm just going to give you some quotes here and just some facts, just so you have them. And then, you may decide that you're extremely liberal politically, economically, everything else. You may decide you're extremely conservative politically, economically, everything else. It's your business. But let's just take a look at some of the facts. There was an interesting quote it's attributed to Napoleon, though a lot of historians say he didn't actually say it. Somebody said it. History is a lie that's agreed upon. I think that's true. Yeah. I've talked about the Russian Revolution and how that was actually created by bankers in Europe and the United States, and I think South America, just because they wanted to take over the economy of Russia. I talked about that what was it called? Keys of the Kingdom. I've talked about it before. I should try to remember the facts about the name of that movie and all those miniseries. The guy said it was a great miniseries. And the guy said, this country is founded upon, of the money, by the money, and for the money. But that's not what's in the Constitution. That's not what this country is really about. But it is largely what it's become. And that's largely a function of human nature. People tend to be greedy, tragically. But see, there's a democracy. Democracy is just majority rules. Ancient Greeks, came up with it. Majority rules, period. That's not what we have in this country, and it's good that we don't have it. We have a constitutional democracy. What does that mean? That means that majority rules, but there are certain parameters within the Constitution that honors individual rights. Now, if you think about it and just look at the history of the United States was created, it was founded upon individual rights. With respect to, the people that came here, the pioneers, the settlers like that. They wanted independence. They wanted freedom. They wanted to be the right to make their own decision. And it's a spirit that created this nation, and is the spirit of the nation. I talked about that one general that worked under George Washington in the American Revolution, and he said he was from Europe, and he was training the American troops. And he said, these Americans, he said, if you tell them to do something, they won't do it. But if you explain to them why it needs to be done that way, it makes sense to them, then okay, they'll do it. That's an independent spirit. And it's a spirit that many governments, and almost to an extent, it almost seems to lead that way with most all governments. People want, what do they want? They want power and money and control. And so over time, that thing starts to get overtaken by government control, central government control. Who was it? Oh, I think it was Ronald Reagan who said, the most dangerous 9 words, or however many it was in the English language, are hello, we're from the government and we're here to help you. Something like that. Yeah. Now, speaking economically, JFK actually talked about this. And he said that just that idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. And now let's just take a step back and look at the country. What's the most prosperous, or what has been historically at least the most prosperous, successful country in the world? It was the United States. And what really built the United States? Oh, the truth of the matter is it was big industry, huge manufacturing, all created and regulated by the big business. It can be healthy or it can be unhealthy. But either way, big business, big industry, big government is the central nervous system to the physiology of the nation. When that central nervous system is unhealthy, be it abusive, and a very economic way, putting children on treadmills and feeding them nothing but sugar water, as did happen in the Industrial Revolution, or be another extreme anti-big business, Either way, communist China, for example, where everything's government controlled. So the point is that the thing needs to be regulated. And where you draw the line with that regulation is really what matters, But a rising tide, you have to feed industry, you have to feed manufacturing, you have to feed business, because that's the central nervous system. When it's healthy, that rises the tide that raises all boats, all individuals. And if you just look at this country, that's how this country became powerful. It was free enterprise. And if you just look at the demographics of the whole thing, economically, people prospered. All levels of life prospered. All levels of the economy prospered. Yeah, there were pockets. Appalachia, there was problems. Different areas among the blacks in the South, there were problems. Those things get addressed. But nevertheless, the main salient theme is valid. A rising tide raises all boats. So it's not about, the little guy versus the big guy. The masses versus the aristocrats. It's about creating a dynamic where they work together constructively, and that requires regulation, But it's a shame, really, that when I was living in India, it was really interesting because I visit, really, really wealthy people, and it's a whole different climate. I mean, they have a lot of servants. They have one people I visited. Their chauffeur lived in the car. He slept in the car. He was available 24/7 that way, anytime they wanted to go anywhere. But it wasn't at all a resentment. The cooks, everybody, it wasn't at all a resentment towards the wealthy people who own the home. It was an appreciation, really, because they gave those people a healthy life, a healthy living. That they wouldn't have had otherwise. And that in this nation, they don't see that very much of that at all. It becomes a resentment, a judgment, a suspicion, a negativity toward the central nervous system, the organizer, the person building that business, the nation. Just tangentially here, they're planning on slaughtering 200,000 cows. Why? To try to bring it into climate change, because, there's that whole idea that cattle are, polluting the environment. I did see something, I can't recall the details, but there was a scientist who said that nothing could be further than the truth. If you really look at the whole cycle and not just some little isolated part of it, cows do a lot to benefit the environment. Do you remember that study, Scotty? I think we talked about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it. I've been seeing a couple of things. I was just on a 9-hour road trip, so I was listening to a lot, and it's a lot of it has to do with how they do it. When in fact we drove past a couple of them, like where they have these just giant lots where they're just all the cows are packed in.
Yeah, feed lots. Yeah.
Yeah, and that might have more impact than having them spread out like over land. And
yeah, that's right. You're right. I recall that it had something to do with how they benefit the land and all like that.
Right. Yeah. So
yeah,
if you have it like it's just like farming, they do more damage when they do the monocrop, plowing the soil, and
this has to be done wisely.
Right. And they say too, there was another thing that was showing just how terrible and how many animals get killed from farming. Like the things get torn up in the plows and the, the birds coming, just so many things compared to how many, I mean, there's the thing where you kill a cow and that's terrible, but how many animals are killed in the production of crops is
Well,
amazing
the
too.
whole thing is remarkable.
Right.
We live in a world where everybody could. Well, it was Buckminster Fuller, operating man for Spaceship Earth. He said that this Earth could sustain way more people than are presently on it. And he also said that all the people could live like millionaires when he wrote the book. Now it's almost like billionaires because of inflation. But we have the potential to do that. We just don't. And I mean, just think about it. All the money, all the energy, all the everything that was invested even in wars, if that money and effort was invested in taking care of the people, serving the people, everybody would be prosperous. So the whole thing is ridiculous. The whole thing is just ridiculous, Now, back to cows, in the whole Vedic tradition, reincarnation, animals reincarnate, people reincarnate. And as they evolve, they reincarnate with a more evolved nervous system, a more evolved species. And it's said that cows reincarnate as Brahmin men, Brahmins being the scholars, the pundits, people with the real knowledge, educators like that. But if they're slaughtered as cattle, what that does is it damages their nervous system. So they reincarnate back with weak nervous systems. And what does that say about the future of the world? If the real scholars, people of real knowledge, if we're trashing their nervous systems, and that just one tangent. I mean, we could go on. Wow, at least I could. Why it's so horrible to slaughter 200,000 cows for climate change, when, as Scotty was just pointing out, it doesn't really have to be that way. You just take care of them properly. Anyway, then I came upon, I don't know if you sent this to me, Scotty, or no, I think it was about Times. I got something from them. There's a movie. It's called Plandemic, like pandemic, but with an L. Plandemic 3, The Great Awakening. And again, these are just the facts, and they provided a lot of fascinating facts, which is why I want to talk about it. And then you decide for yourself. I mean, maybe you're into communism, maybe you're into socialism, maybe you're into some of these things. Or maybe you're opposed to those things. It's your decision. There was a guy named Edward Griffin. They talk about him in the movie. And we have the link, by the way, to the movie in the notes to this podcast. When you go to the blog, you can scroll down and find it. But this guy was really interesting. He was back in the 50s or 60s in there. And he was warning about, communist infiltration and what was happening in the world. As I've talked about before, I think it's pretty much common knowledge now if you're paying attention. And he said socialism is a transitional state leading to communism. And that may not sound, oh boy, scare tactics or something. It may sound like that. But if you just look historically at different countries, Argentina, Cuba, blah, blah, that's what happens. That's what happens. It's happened over and over again. Okay. Now we have the World Economic Forum, and they meet in Davos, in Switzerland, and a lot of the different economic and social leaders from all over the world go to that. And just to see, and this is all just documented fact, the things that's being said there. This Klaus Schwab guy, he's some multi-billionaire or whatever, and he's spooky. He spooks me. I mean, Scotty, did you see some of the videos of him? He dresses like Darth Vader without the helmet.
Like the perfect villain character from a James Bond movie. Yeah.
Yes, that's correct. But they talked there about COVID-19 being the great reset to one world government, one world order. They're all into globalism, and they even said their globalist shining model is China, CCP, Communist China. I mean, they torture people. It's horrible. And talking about, they even talk about human rights. They're not into human rights. They're not into individual rights. It's the antithesis of, as I was saying, what birthed America, for example. It's all about the group. And that's what matters. There was a quote here that I saw that I liked. I'll find it. But totalitarianism, it makes the state overpower all else, including the family. And they talked about how the family is, in fact, the threat to globalism, because it becomes a unit that maintains an integrity, so you have to break that up. And that's what we're seeing. We're even seeing it in this country with the whole transsexual movement. It's not the parents' business whether or not the kid is, identifying with a certain gender or what have you.
Well, Michael, it's also, look at the divorce rates. The families aren't staying together. You look at what's happened with different segments of society, and that's one of the biggest problems that you have with kids, is that the families aren't staying together.
There was a guy at Davos. I can't pronounce his name. Yuval Noah Harari. He got up and spoke, and he said, and you can see it if you watch that movie, you'll see it. The video of him saying this: soul, spirit, and free will are BS. Wait a minute, Nelson. He really said that? Yes, he did. Soul, spirit, free will. They're also talking about the central bank. Do you understand the importance of the central bank, the central currency, which is the US dollar? See what that does, and it's a big reason why the US has been able to print so many dollars and not have inflation just go crazy, is because when countries deal with other countries, it's all done in the US dollar. That's the central banking system. And as a result, then all these different countries, have their accounts in US dollars. What does that do? It creates a great demand for the dollar. What does that do? It sustains the value of the dollar. If there's more demand, then you can have more dollars out there. You can print more money, and it maintains its value, supply and demand. But there's a big movement now by China and Russia. And they're actually doing this with some nations. They're starting to trade in other currencies, not the US dollar, but rather what is the yuan and the ruble. Now we might say, well, that's only fair, that's only good. But now here, keep in mind that the whole economic stability of the globe, of the nation, would be turned upside down. It would cause crisis in many nations if the US dollar got dropped. It would completely trash the US economy as well as many other economies throughout the world.
Michael, I think,
and they're pushing for it. They're pushing for it. Go ahead.
Well, I think we also need to do more studies, because from what I understand, I've talked to a couple of globalists, like those guys that study that. There's a guy out of Colorado, Peter something or other, and he's talking about how, this really can't sustain itself, because if those guys lie about their economies, Russia and China, both, nobody really knows what's going on inside of there, because they can control everything so well. they don't know how stable those are. So some people are making these deals, but they could be making bad deals. Where United States, we're a little bit more transparent on what we, the stability of the
Well,
dollar versus the stability of
yeah,
the yuan is better.
I wouldn't use the word transparent, though I
Yeah,
appreciate what you're
but you know
saying.
what I mean. It's like,
But stability is there to some
yeah,
degree, and if it got flipped, it would just be chaos.
right.
Yeah.
So
Another quote they said there was really interesting. Those who control the data control the future of humanity. And you know about TikTok and trying to get information and even free DNA test kits. They're accumulating data on the nature of DNA in different countries with the eye on how they can do genetic engineering and creating vaccines or this or that would have a negative effect on certain DNA types. But I think it's an incredible quote, really. Those who control the data control the people, control the world, control humanity. So here's the other thing they talk about. Fear and disconnect leads to susceptibility. So if there's disconnect from the powers that be, if there's disconnect between races, if there's disconnect between cultures, if there's disconnect between nations, as fear gets created, fear thy neighbor, that sort of a thing. It makes people susceptible to turning their power over to an authoritarian, totalitarian government. Take care of us. And you see it in this country. I mean, it's hard to find employees. I mean, you hear that everywhere. You see that everywhere. Why? Because the government's taking care of them. It creates a disconnect from the very essence of what's required to really make a economy go, a nation go.
Michael, it's not only that; it's the wars, the UFOs are coming, all these things that
Yeah,
they're
that's
trying
right.
to.
COVID-19, they called COVID-19 a great opportunity to implement globalism. Why? Because everybody was terrified. So now they can step in and they can pass laws, as was done in this country, to regulate things that really was unconstitutional to regulate. But in the name of a pandemic, and so the more horrified they could make people, the better, because they could get more control. There were some incredible quotes, like by Karl Marx, the communist. He says he was really into abolition of the family. He said the biggest obstacle to global takeover is the family unit. Totalitarianism makes state overpower all else, including the family unit. That's frightening stuff. Black Lives Matter leaders openly identify with Marxism. And you see what happens? You got this upper crust, the globalist leaders were buying what, $3 million mansions or something with all that money. And so they cease to be interested in the people. It becomes this huge chasm between the masses that they want to control and regulate and the upper crust. Fear instills submission to authoritarianism. It's an important quote. Carl Jung, the psychologist, the state takes the place of God. The socialist dictatorships are religions, and state slavery is a form of worship. That's Carl Jung, America, conversely, was born of individual rights and freedoms. That's what we're familiar with as Americans. It's in other countries too, but as Americans, that's in the soil. That's in the spirit of the nation. I lived in South Carolina for a while, and to me, that feeling of individual rights and stuff was very palpable there. And we could go back and forth about South Carolina this, South Carolina that, but nevertheless, it was refreshing. Individual rights, you know.
Well, if you look at just the genesis of the United States, it's like it was a bunch of people that were sick of living under government control and
Totalitarianism.
tyranny
That's
and
right.
all that other stuff, and they came over here to
Correct.
let's change it. And then it's like they could do it. We did it for a while, and then now all of that is just creeping in again. And
Well, and that's just like this, what this guy said back in the 50s and 60s. So that I mentioned earlier, that G. Edward Griffin, you know, and they have him on film in that Plandemic 3. You can watch him, the stuff he said. I mean, you're exactly right, Scotty, and he predicted it, you know, a long time ago, 50 years ago, more, you know. In collectivism, the group is more important than the individual. In a constitutional democracy, the individual is what takes precedent. Protect the individual rights. Now, admittedly, you know, a lot of people throw this up. Oh, well, yeah, but they had slavery, and what kind of individual rights are that? That's correct. It was a problem at the time. Many people, even back then, were opposed to it. And it's not consistent. It is not consistent with what's within the Constitution, constitutional democracy, obviously. And great strides have been taken to reverse that. But how do they play it? They play it as blacks versus whites, you know, and it's all over the place. I mean, not just blacks versus whites, but, you know, anti-Chinese, anti-Semitic, anti-this, anti-that, polarizing, divide the nation, divide and conquer, you know. Just a few last things here. If you don't know who Saul Alinsky is, find out. You can Google him. Saul, S-A-U-L, the last name Alinsky, A-L-I-N-S-K-Y. Just look at his quotes and realize that he was a mentor of Bill and Hillary Clinton. They had him in his wedding. I think she wrote her master's, what do they call it, dissertation or whatever, about him, I think. But anyway, there's a very close tie there, and he's worth knowing about. Okay. Also, one thing I want to say, you know, risk aversion. You know, we don't want to take unnecessary risks. Maybe me even talking this way is taking the risk. I don't care. You know, I mean, if you betray yourself, you got nothing left, you know. But it's important to realize that perhaps the greatest risk is doing nothing. And that doesn't apply to politics. That applies to everything in life. Even little tiny decisions. Should I do this or should I do that? Well, I don't know. So you don't do anything. I remember Maharshi used to say, put something out, you know, see what comes back, and then adjust accordingly. But don't, and I'm adding this, but don't just do nothing for fear of taking a risk. That's the biggest risk of all. And that's why, you know, pencils come with erasers. You put something out, if it didn't work, you just adjust accordingly. You can always erase. Life is a risk, even if you do nothing. It's even more of a risk if you do nothing. Your life is a result of a string of decisions. Indecision is perhaps the most powerful decision of all. There's that whole principle of, you know, you take a frog, you put him in some water, you slowly heat up the water in a frying pan, and the frog won't move because it's warming up slowly until he just boils to death. Doing nothing. And as the economy changes, as the world changes, as all this stuff that all these guys are warning about with respect to communist China and Russian infiltration, and we're not talking about this recent stuff we're talking about, but way back when Khrushchev pounding his shoe on the desk at the UN saying, we will destroy you from within, or however he put it. Don't be a boiling frog. It's simple. So obviously my bias has been more self-evident than I wanted it to be, but how can I help it, But wade through that as you will, but don't bury your head in the sand of the facts that we've cited here. And if you don't believe me, research it yourself. And I think that's all we've got for this Father's Day. Happy Father's Day. And Scotty, is there anything more?
No, I think for next time, it was making me think about the middle road and how, that gets misconstrued and how
compromise and a whitewashing, yeah.
Right. And what it really means. And that's the only other thing I can think of, that if you wanted to talk about it a little bit, but just,
we will. And the other thing I want to talk about, and remind me, Scott, here, I'll write it down after we close here, but
yeah,
the way I was brought up, I was brought up really by Maharishi. And the way I was brought up, it came in a conversation I had just last night, it came to my realization that it's not the way that most people have been led to think and led to function and led to believe. And I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to talk about that next week. So for now, we'll close. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again next week.